Yes, I think we can start now. I just want to welcome you very, very briefly, Esther, to the office of the Secretary General. This is a first virtual session that we have. I must accept that when you came to the OECD to the Angus Madison lecture, you left me bewildered and begobbled about your proposal of economists having to think and act like plumbers. And I am very much looking forward to listen to your ideas and to see if this has changed after the COVID-19, which has changed so many things for us. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the floor to the Secretary General, who's going to give some welcoming remarks, and then we will give you the floor for a presentation.
For how long you want me to present?
Well, if you speak for 20, 30 minutes, and then we can have Q&A, that would be wonderful.
Perfect.
Secretary General.
So welcome to the 31st session of the Coffees with the Secretary General of the OECD. This initiative to keep the organization in constant communication with the world's brightest minds, with people who are stretching the horizons of knowledge in many different fields to create what we would call the DNA of a better and brighter world. Today's guest is one of these pathfinders, one of these explorers. So we welcome Esther Duflo, a long-standing friend of the OECD, who is joining us today from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Esther is the 2019 Nobel Prize of Economics for her work, and I quote, experimental approach to alleviating global poverty. She's also, she has a chair in economics at the MIT, the Abdul Latif Jameel, and also she is a co-founder and co-director of the Poverty Action Lab. She will be speaking to us about good economics for harder times, responding to the worldwide COVID-19 crisis, and what a pertinent title for such challenging times. As Esther will probably agree, the COVID-19 is really challenging not only our economics and our social and our health institutions, but also our economic theories and our economic policies, certainly. So it will be very, very important to listen carefully to Esther Duflo. These because we are nourished, we are nurtured by the greatest talents, and because in the end, our motto, Esther, is better policies for better lives, which means we have to learn as much as we can from people like yourself to be able then to perform a better service in terms of giving advice to our countries so that they adopt the better policies for better lives. So we will, following your talk, it's 4:03 or something like that, 4:04, and then we will use hopefully till 4:30, and then if there's time, but you know, take your time, feel comfortable in terms of developing whatever you have to say, and hopefully then there'll be time for a few questions. So the floor is yours. Welcome, Esther Duflo.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation and for everybody to take time out of your busy schedule to join. It is amazing how this whole thing where we are staying at home all day is actually much more busy and hectic than the normal life. So I'm grateful for you to be there. I'm going to share my screen, and if I can, and yes. My screen refuses to share. Let's see.
There it goes.
Sorry about that.
That's it.
Yep. I'm very happy to present to you today. So in 2000, actually mostly over a year in Paris, in which I visited the OECD for some times, Abhijit Banerjee and I wrote a book called Good Economics for Hard Times. This was pre-COVID, and this now have become harder times. And what I want to talk to you about today is how some of the lessons that we were trying to do in the pre-pandemic time might still apply today. So most issues that are important today are core economic issues. So this, in blue, you have the pre-February 2020 issues: Brexit, trade, immigration, lagging economic growth, inequality, social policy, climate change. Those are big issues, but they kind of faded starting in January, February of 2020. With the pandemic and the economic issues that it brings in its wake. And of course, particularly in the US, but I know it's come to even to Paris to some extent, is the sudden awakening to the importance of racism and discrimination in Western societies, which is also something we are finding in poorer countries as well. So unfortunately, despite this role of economics in our life, economists have less important in our life, partly because they have lost most of their credibility. So this is a poll that was taken by YouGov in the UK in February of 2017, just after the Brexit vote, where you can see that only 25% of people trust economists about their own field of expertise. That's half of the trust in weather forecasters. 51% of people trust weather forecasters. And that's of course less than nurses, and much less than nurses and doctors. The only people who are trusted less than economists are politicians. We did a very similar survey in the US about a year after this one, and found precisely the same ranking and almost the same numbers. So why is that? So beyond that, it's not just that the economists say that they disagree with economists, that they don't trust economists, and then they actually listen to them. Because on most core economic issues, people disagree with economists. So this is an example. That's a question we asked to a representative sample of Americans in 2019. Imposing new US tariffs on steel and aluminum would improve Americans' well-being. So the question, well, the reason why the question is asked in terms of steel and aluminum is that it was the policy proposal that was put forward by the Trump administration at the time. And you can see that about a third of people think that it would be a good thing. And then you might think that then the reason we phrased the question exactly this way is that the same question was asked of about 50 economists who are part of the IGM Booth pool at the University of Chicago. So they really represent a cross-section of faculty members at all top economics department and business schools in the US. And you might think that I'm about to show you an animation with the bar, but that's the bar. No one thinks that, none of the experts think that it's a good idea. So it's an example where you see a pretty big gap between what people in general think and what experts think. And furthermore, it's not because people haven't heard what economists say, because when you take any particular issue and then you inform people of what economists tend to think about the issues, that doesn't do anything to change the opinion of people. Excuse me, let me do one thing. There is a lawn mower right outside my window. I couldn't hear myself, so I suppose you could not hear me either. So when you inform people of what economists think of an issue, that doesn't really change their opinion on what they should think. So people do not declare that they don't trust economists, and they very much act as if they didn't. So why is that the case? Why this mistrust? And you might see, well, you know, let's just think about it. Well, one reason is that people mostly think that economists are forecasters. A big job of many big departments in various large organizations such as yours is to predict what's going to happen to the economy. And we are notoriously bad at doing that. In particular, there is a paper from the IMF showing that the IMF fails to predict every single recession that they have looked at. And it's not just the IMF, the consensus of professional forecasters doesn't do any better. So we are not very good at what people think is our main business. Furthermore, to the extent that economists are in the news, it's usually not in a very good light. So this is a headline from the New York Times for just a few days ago, which talks about economics dominated by white men is ruled by Black Lives Matter. And this echoes a debate that has taken place apropos the chief editor of the Journal of Political Economy, who made some, like, let's say, racially insensitive comments on Twitter. And this is what people usually think of economists as doing. And instances like that, of course, reinforces his opinion. Here's another example of the Wall Street Journal picking a couple of articles on policing that argue that maybe there is no racial differences in the treatment of people by the police, and titling on the myth of systemic police racism. So this type of article, the way that economics is used, presented in the media and also used in the media, is often contribute to, given a representation of economists as kind of defenders of the status quo and not very interesting in social progress. So we could say, well, it doesn't really matter. This is kind of a losing battle. Anything we do is going to be insufficient, not enough. What we do need is sociologists and epidemiologists and vaccine scientists, but not economists. But of course, economics has a lot to bring to the table. And not only it has a lot to bring to the table, but it's not that economists are stuck in their ivory tower and not interested in contributing. And in particular, there has been a huge rush in COVID-19 research, which you could say is a bit opportunistic, but on the other hand, I think demonstrate a desire in the profession to try and be relevant and useful, and possibly an ability to do that. And similarly, I think the perception that many people, including graduate students who complain about that to me, for example, that none of the important social issues, including racism, which is one of the big issues that is being discussed these days in the US, is published in mainstream journals. But in fact, there is a lot of it done, but this is not the economics we tend to hear about. Like most of quiet economics, it's get done. So I think instead of giving up, what we need to do is to kind of bring back to the fore the economic analysis on a wide variety of issues, in warts and all, including the debate, the things that we are not sure about, giving people more about how we get to conclusion and not just the conclusions themselves, and try to regain a legitimate seat at the table for discussion in this way. So this is what we try to do in our book, Good Economics for Hard Times. And I'm not going to summarize the book for you, but I'm just going to extract 5 lessons which are a bit cross-cutting across the various themes that we look at in the book, and discuss and show how they're still valid for harder times. The first one is actually the title of one of our chapters, legit.gov. And it's about the place of the government and the perception of the government in the public. And so you will recall from the graph I showed early in the presentation that the only people who are least trusted than economists are politicians. and that extends to the government as an institution. There has been, for a while, maybe at least since Reagan, and the idea that government is not the solution but the problem, a huge backlash against governments. This is a funny posters from the Tea Party around the attempt to, when President Obama was trying to pass the Affordable Care Act, where you have keep government out of my Medicare, showing the lack of understanding that the government is actually running Medicare. But it is something which is not just Tea Party enthusiasts. This is something that economists play a big role in always being very skeptical of the government and people who work for them. So there is this permanent worry that the government would be a set of scumbag bureaucrats who are at best ineffective and at worst corrupt. And that's very dangerous because, first of all, I think it's misleading. It's not that there is no corruption or difficulty in government, but it's forgetting that what governments try to do is very difficult. So governments are always stepping in when the market has been unable to to find a solution. So for example, government is the one who are forcing us to wear masks today, are forcing us to limit our emissions. So this is precisely when you try to go against the grain that you need the government to intervene, and that's why it's hard to do. And when you do these things with the market, you have the same issues as, for example, the huge scandal in private colleges admission as shown in the US. Now, the COVID-19 crisis reminds us why we need governments, and not just economists, but the public at large. Shutting down your business, starting a lockdown, wearing a mask, etc. These are activities that have big private costs and huge externalities. So they can only be put in place when there is regulations to do it. And I think it was obvious at the lockdown that you needed a government, and a government that people trust to some extent, to enforce a lockdown. And it's obvious also in the reopening, where we're seeing that there is no rules, people do just anything. Like there is no ability to internalize that even though the lockdown has been lifted, the virus is still with us and one still needs to be cautious of others. Of course, you need governments to stockpile ventilators, to pay for vaccine efforts, and also to administer, borrow money to have the economic rescue package. Only government has the ability to borrow money for essentially nothing and support their people and the economy at large. So this could be, I think, a make or break moment for governments in many countries, in Latin America and in the US and in several countries in Europe, in the sense that this could be the moment where the government discovers that we really need it, and therefore there is an increase in the legitimacy of the government. Or this could be a moment where the government screws up massively, just precisely when we needed it, furthering the crisis of confidence that exists. So I think this is a very important time to kind of do everything we can to support the action of the government, advise, etc. The second lesson, I think, which is very obvious in the pandemic, is that financial incentives are overrated. This is something that was a conclusion in the book, and that I've, even showed even more than ever overrated. So you would think everybody has agreed with that. In fact, even in the US, the rescue package started with generous unemployment benefits that were hard to get hold of, but once you had them, were quite generous and unconditional, essentially. And in Europe, the wage support through the funds have played the same role, even more effectively. But now, even though we are still in the middle of the economic crisis, this idea that people would become lazy if they have unemployment insurance is coming back, which I find completely remarkable. So this is again a recent headline from the New York Times. Chuck Grassley, a Republican of Iowa, said the 600 weekly payments were poorly targeted, with the result that most recipients would be paid more on unemployment insurance than they earned when they were working. this discourages people from returning to work or taking a new job, delaying the recovery. And he says it as a fact, even though there are scores and scores and scores of economic research over the years showing that there is no such effect of fixed income, that regardless of the countries, giving people money doesn't really discourage them from working, and people would much rather have a job. So I think one of the reasons for that is that there is a discrepancy between people's own response and people's perception of what other people would do. So for example, the first line in this graph says, suppose there was a universal basic income, would you stop working or would other people stop working? So we asked this question either about themselves to half of our sample, or to the other half we asked about other people. And we see that the vast majority of people say they would not stop working, but about half of them think that other people would stop working. So one of the problems there is that although people are unresponsive themselves, both to replacement rate and to income effects, they worry that other people are, and therefore that makes it a powerful political argument to restrict transfers, even in a situation like today, where it seems it would be beneficial for everyone if consumption was maintained. The third lesson that you also get, that was true even before the pandemic, and is of course become even more true today, is that the economy is very sticky. So most of our economic models assume that once there is a shock somewhere or in some sector, people can adjust and move to another region or another sector. So for example, if you were making furniture in North Carolina and your shop closes because of trade with China, you lose your job in North Carolina, but you can move to New York and you become a security guard in a furniture store. And that job was created because of trade with China. In fact, in reality, the mobility, both geographic and by sector, has reduced a lot in the US in the last few decades. It was always lower in Europe, of course, because of language barriers and very strong attachment to local villages. But even in the US, you can see that since 1984, it's been divided roughly in half. So in 1984, 14% of people left their county every year, and it's moved to about 7% in 2016. With the pandemic, this is going to be even more. So first of all, the first thing that happened is all the borders got closed, and it became difficult to move even within the country. In the poorer countries, what we have seen is a complete collapse of the situation of the internal migrants, because in many cases, internal migrants live on their work site, and when the work site got shut, they lost their home, and their benefits are tied to their village. So what you had is that a bunch of people, as soon as the economy went into lockdown, a bunch of people actually trying to go back to where they came from, which has led to this huge movement of people, which of course is not very good from the health perspective, plus migrants detained in camps where people were dying of other diseases or dying of hunger because they were not, nobody really was there to take care of them. So in the future, anyone who is considering migrating to a city in order to take advantage of the opportunities there is going to think twice, because if there is a next lockdown, this is going to happen again. So that means that the economy, this temporary migration that were very, very important to smooth part of the seasonal variation in livelihood are going to be shut or much reduced, which is further going to limit the ability of economies to grow and to adjust to new opportunities. The fourth one is particularly relevant for us in the US in the last few days. The last 3 weeks really have been roiled by very moving, very touching anti-racism protests spurred by the killing of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, but really touching on something much deeper about the treatment of African American in this country. And the nature of the conversation today is not just about racist, about police violence, although that is part of it. But it's also spurred, I believe, by the huge disparity in the extent to which the COVID pandemic has touched Black and white communities. You can see here the deaths, for example, being so much larger for Black than for white community in these 3 sample cities. And it's a very, very striking fact. And there is a, finally, what is coming to the fore is the idea, which has been true for a long time, but as maybe not as much to the forefront, or at least among white people, that discrimination and racism are everywhere, and you sense them everywhere, and the behavior of the police is just the emerged side of the iceberg. So this is very much true, but then you might wonder, well, is it because people are fundamentally racist and there is nothing you can do about it? And the good news is that seems very much not true, in the sense that economists economists again have a doubtful pedigree there, which I think is a little bit why the inappropriate comments of the editor of the JP got so much flack. Because there is this tradition in economics, at least since Becker and Stigler, that preferences are what they are, and they are immutable, and they don't really change, and there's really nothing we can do about them. And you could try and regulate racist behavior away, but that would make white people unhappy, and therefore it would be difficult to vote for it, and etc., etc. But in fact, there is plenty of evidence from now decades of research in sociology, but also in behavioral economics, showing that there is really no such thing as the concept of stable preferences, which is something that is just something you're endowed with. And that what we call preferences is very much the reflection of an acceptable norm at a point in time, and it kind of changes easily. And this is not, to demonstrate it, just a simple experiment where in Switzerland, they brought in bankers to the lab and they asked them to play a game where you throw a coin, and if you have tail, you're paid as a function of the number of times that the coin lands on the tail. So of course you can cheat because nobody is watching you. They don't know, you cannot tell whether anyone in particular has cheated, but you can see whether as a group people tend to cheat. So when this is a frequent task, a frequently used task, and people do cheat on this task. For these bankers, what they did is that they separated them into 2 groups. One group, they asked them to reflect about their weekends, so priming their identity as a family men and women. And one group, they primed them about their job, thus priming their identity as bankers. And what you can see on the right graph here is that the people who were primed in their identity as banker cheat much, much more than the people who were primed as family men. So even something as deep as your propensity to cheat, or what is important for social status, can be manipulated by who you think you are at a given point. And that's encouraging because that means that preferences can be changed, can be taught, and that so we shouldn't take we should not take racist behavior as a given, but we should take it as a product of the social structure, as well as the exposure that we have to each other and the education that people get. The 5 lessons, and that's where I'll stop, is the very much, again, run throughout the book, is maybe the one exception to that is people are keenly, for them what is key is to maintain their dignity. And that is true. That's one of the reasons why we don't find much elasticity of work with respect to unemployment benefits, because the reality is people want to work. In Western society, this is considered to be a marker of having a role in society, and therefore work is part of your dignity. Our social system, in particular in the last few years, maybe the last few decades, there has been an erosion of people's sense of their own status. Partly because of rapid change in the structure of jobs and the geography of jobs. People, in particular, this is a photo from, this is an image from Angus Deaton and Ann Keyes about white non-Hispanics, aged 45 to 54, where you can see the direct consequence of this loss of a perception of who you are and your status in the society. You can see that from 2000 to 2014, you have an explosion of what they call deaths of despair, which are deaths by suicide, overdose, of alcohol or opioid overdose. And you can see a huge increase in that in this particular group, which is closely linked, as they show as well, to a loss of status. They are less likely to be married, they are less likely to have a job, they are less likely to be in a family. So what what this loss of dignity is maybe relatively recent for this white middle class, but of course has been a little bit at the core of the way that we are treating the poorer people all over the world, where our social welfares are basically designed to rob people of their dignity. And I'm saying design because I don't think it's a byproduct of an attempt to do something else. I think it is the intent since the Victorian era to have social protection systems that are punitive, because we are so worried about this incentive effect I was describing before. So either in India or in the US or in France, any effort to get benefits goes along with making you sure that you really understand you are a loser. And this is extraordinarily costly because it makes everybody extremely nervous of losing their status, because they would lose not only their economic meaning, but their dignity in the process. And what this COVID crisis gives us is the opportunity to put dignity back at the center of social protection, because there is such a wide spread need for it now that why not? So this is the this becomes much more acceptable, and it doesn't become something that others take advantage of, or something that I have to do because I am a loser. It's something we all have to do because, well, we were hit by a virus, and that happens. And that's, I think, could be, this is less in the discussion than rethinking trade or whatever people are discussing, but I think it is actually the closest to what we could have a discussion and debate about, which would be extremely positive for the future. So I'm going to stop here and stop sharing my screen, and I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Esther. That was super interesting. SG, we're going to open the floor to questions. You want to comment something before? Or?
No. Lord, have the public. We have about 600 people connected, and growing all the time. So give them a chance. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Let me invite the ambassador of Costa Rica, who has actually expressed his interest in posing a question. Manuel Tovar, if you want to kick off the session. You have to unmute.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Madame Duflo, for sharing with us a few minutes today of your time. The dramatic eruption of COVID-19 has brought enormous challenges to humanity. To confront a phenomena of such dimensions and mitigate its effect in our economies and societies, governments need to effectively articulate policy responses so that no one is left behind. This brings me to a special group of people, children. I would like to hear views on what governments should do to prevent that no child is left behind when it comes to the existing digital divide in education in the developing world. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think if we are thinking about the developing world, we want to take it even one degree further, which is how do we think about education in during something like a lockdown where most people realistically do not have access to digital devices, might not all have access to a phone. So in the current lockdown, people were probably left all over the place. And even those who have digital devices may or may not have parental support. If their parents are not literate, like it's very difficult to work with the kids. We do know that there is something called summer slide, which is like in the summer, the poor kids lose much more than the richer kids in terms of learning. So I think what we have to think now is what to do when we come back. And the key is that's the first thing we have to think about. And the key is to meet every child where they are, not try to go back and go back to the curriculum or try to teach everything the same way. There is going to be widespread heterogeneity of where the kids are at, and it's going to be very key to meet them exactly at that level. And then moving forward in preparing for the next wave of the pandemic, if there is one, then you're exactly right. Expand access to very cheap digital devices. They are cheaper now, or even telephones. In India, where a lot of people do not have digital devices, just access to a phone and the ability to talk to a parent and say, here is an activity you could do with your kids. Think about analog material that can be distributed to support these activities. This is how you're really going to get to the poorer kid.
Excellent. I'm going to ask everyone to introduce themselves before posing the question, please. I have Angel first and then Bernard.
Well, Angel is actually me, simply because, let me put it this way, Esther. We at the OECD, we are, before the crisis, we were confronted with a slowdown. We had these trade tensions. We had lost the trade dynamics because investment was suffering because of the uncertainty created by the trade tensions, the story, and then COVID hit. Huh? Now, you put in there all the elements that already we were having before. These continue. And then you added the pandemic, and then you added the question of the inequalities and to make it just worse. Now, the question is the policy mix today. We're being told you have to choose between lives and livelihoods. It has become almost like a cliche, or you have to choose between the economy and the health and therefore the speed of reopening instead of being more cautious, the pressure of reopening. So what does one of the world's greatest experts in poverty, President Alvarado of Costa Rica, precisely was telling me that the problem here is you have to choose between hunger and the virus. People have to go out every day and make a living. So how does, on the developing side, on the developing country side, how does the policy mix in the face of what's going on?
So that's a great question. I don't think there is a trade-off between lives and livelihoods because the two are intimately connected. So what we've seen is that basically many poor countries started with a very strict lockdown, like India, for example, where nobody was sick yet. But then that's not sustainable. So they had to shut down, they had to stop the lockdown precisely when people started getting sick. So the timing was just terrible. But one could argue that they had to do the lockdown early on because they were buying time. But what this demonstrates is that you can only sustain something like an economic lockdown for a period, like a strict economic lockdown for a short period of time, unless you are able to financially support people. And then if you cannot sustain the lockdown, then you cannot save lives. So I don't think there is a trade-off. It has to be managed. Any kind of restriction in economic activity have to be managed to keep in mind both the lives and the livelihood at the same time. And in my opinion, and this is, we have been trying to write about this to encourage that, is the way to do it in the poorest country is by having in place what we call the universal very basic income, which is a floor of sustenance, so that people, even if they have completely lost their livelihood, can continue to survive. And this is expensive, but this is nothing compared to the amount of money that rich countries have borrowed to spend on themselves. So this is something that, as an international community, we could definitely afford. For Africa, for poor places in India, for Bangladesh, for Pakistan. And this would be even, so first of all, it seems that it makes complete ethical sense. And second of all, even from a self-interested perspective, it also makes sense, because if the epidemics flare up and becomes catastrophic in Africa or in South Asia, it is coming back to us. So we're already seeing it now in Latin America, that is really coming, where the epicenter are moving now, between Brazil, of course, which chose their own path, and but also Peru, which was doing well initially, is now. So we're seeing Latin America now. The next wave, if it's Africa or India, it will come back to the rich countries. So these countries don't have the financial capacity to do a universal basic income for any long periods of time. But this is where, both for ethical and justice reason and for purely self-interested health reason, I think the world should come together and finance it. Again, through borrowing, and it would hardly register given the amount of borrowing that we are doing in the OECD to sustain our own economy.
Excellent. Now we have Jeff and then Duncan. If you can introduce yourself, please.
Sure. Thank you, Mario. It's Jeff Barnard. I'm an advisor in the Office of the Secretary General. The question I had was, you I think, very convincingly argued that social protection systems have been designed to be punitive and to rob dignity. And anybody who's seen the movie I, Daniel Blake will know what you're talking about. But I wondered if you could expand a bit on how you would see how we put dignity at the center of social protection. I guess what you've already started to talk about there with developing countries gives us a sense, but is this the time for going ahead with some form of universal basic income? Are there other things we can do? How do we go about putting dignity at the center of social protection?
So I think for the developing country, it can go with a universal ultra basic income, because the biggest risk to the loss of dignity is it's still the danger to not being able to put food on the table 3 times a day for your kids. And that's kind of the biggest threat. And if that's removed with a universal ultra basic income, which is not that expensive, because you really only need to provide this very, very basic minimum, and people could be required to sign up each month where they need it. So, the people who are doing well wouldn't take it in a given month. It wouldn't be difficult. It wouldn't be a difficult sign up, but it would require to self-certify as needing the money. So only people who really need it would take it. So it would be bearable in terms of budget, much easier to administer than the complicated hodgepodge of various subsidies that exist today in developing countries, and would leave scope to do the rest of the things government need to do for social protection, like of course, and health and education. In the rich countries, it's a bit different because of this, because all of the surveys suggest that dignity is really very much attached to having a productive place in society and working. And therefore, a universal basic income would not give back to people the dignity that they have lost if they don't have a job. So it sort of wouldn't serve the purpose. And also, in order to give people a decent lifetime, all the advocates say you would need $13,000 per year. To finance something like that, in the US, you would need to scrap every existing program and increase taxes enormously to make it possible. So that doesn't seem very likely. And in addition, we have much better abilities to target transfers because we have good information system. So you kind of know who is going to be hurt, who is going to be hurt by trade, who is going to be hurt by automation. And you can target your assistance to them. And you can do it in a way that is, even in the current system in France, there are pockets where people are behaving quite differently. So we in our book, we discuss, for example, a program by a Mission Locale. So Mission Locale are kind of a one-stop shop for youth unemployment and social services, where they really start from, they work with young people who've had very difficult existence, and they really start from people project and from people ambition, and from there they give them back the confidence that they have been, that has been systematically undermined all their life, and that actually has an impact on their ability to then get into regular employment, etc. So this I think it's more a matter of changing the mindset of how we do things. And also something we discussed in the book, and I think becomes even more present now, is kind of do, if you want, smart Keynesianism, which is create jobs, not just for the sake of create jobs, but try to pick sectors where the productivity gains through robots, etc., is unlikely to work very well, like healthcare, helping old people, preschool. Those are sectors where one could decide to invest a lot of money, public money, thus creating jobs that would be good jobs with good careers. And then you could put people in those jobs, and then that would create dignified employment at the same time as you create public good. So that's kind of more the way we are thinking about it for the rich countries.
Hi, shall I go, Mario? And hi, I'm Duncan Caspegs. I'm the Counselor for Strategic Foresight here at the OECD. And so I want to ask you about the future, but you mentioned that economists, one of the reasons they've got a bad name is through unfounded predictions. So don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to make a prediction. But in fact, the main point that we try to put across here at the OECD and with our partners is that in the face of high uncertainty and high unpredictability, responsible policymaking really requires exploring and preparing for a diverse range of plausible scenarios. And the starting point for that is really identifying what the key uncertainties are about the future, instead of sort of ignoring or brushing over those uncertainties. So I guess I want to ask you what you would see in your policy, in your field, particularly around poverty alleviation, as some of the key uncertainties that we just don't know now about what the future could bring, but that could have a significant impact on this space, and that we should be keeping in mind potentially, multiple scenarios within that space as we're devising our policies. So another way of asking this question is, if you were to meet yourself in 5, 10, or 15 years, if you could have a Zoom call, what would the question be that you would ask yourself? You know, the burning question. You'd say, "Tell me this," to answer one of the uncertainties you're puzzling with now.
The unknowns. That's the. Look, I think it's the right question, and I think it's a very difficult question, and I am very much above my pay grade. We were joking with a Chinese friend of mine that in January we were discussing what was happening in China, and it did not occur to either him or us that it was coming for us. So when you have such big blind spots, you know, predicting what are the source of uncertainty is really difficult. And I don't think any individual person is well placed to do it. But what is striking, but maybe I would suggest more a process to do it, is rather than asking, any smart people you meet, what do you think is going to happen, is to go by sectors, because very early in something on March 15 or 16, at the very beginning of the lockdown, my kids were watching a documentary on the flu, which was done during the H1N1 pandemic, the one that didn't turn into a disaster. And I was overhearing what the people were saying. And they interviewed epidemiologists talking about the biggest risk that could happen is a worldwide pandemic, and this is how it would happen, and this is what would take place, and we would have to lock down the economy. And I was like, wow, that was like 15 years ago, and we knew it. So someone knows it. The reality is that I don't have the answer to your question, but someone does. And we are not very good, I think, collectively as society, to listen to them. In part because we suffer from collective projection bias, which is we assume whatever old state we are on is going to continue for the future. In part because no one loves to contemplate bad situation. In part because the human brain is particularly not wired to deal with ambiguity. So we can live with uncertainty and the probability that this will happen. But if we can't even know the shape of the distribution, it's quite unsettling. And therefore, because of all this kind of psychological limitation we have that prevents us to be prepared, it takes, again, like a responsible government or international institutions such as yours to do the thinking for us by aggregating the perspective of the experts. So the health experts knew, they knew it. They just weren't able to communicate it to us.
Excellent. We have Karen Maguire, Juan Yermo, and Stefan Jacobson. I think that's gonna fill up our time, but we listen to you, Karen.
Thank you, Dr. Duflo. My name is Karen Maguire, and I lead a group that looks at issues related to social economy, as well as local labor markets. My questions are, first, what is your thought about the role of the social economy in terms of bringing back dignity, given the focus of such entities that tries to have business models with dignity at its core? And the second question is your opinion about job mobility and the fact that there is a decline in geographic mobility, and therefore, what are public policies you think are most effective in creating jobs where people live? Because often the emphasis is on reducing regulations that might restrict mobility, but maybe there are other issues keeping people where they are currently living. Thank you.
Right, great questions. So I think social economy is a broad term. I can cover many different aspects, but you're right to point out the notion, because I discussed the loss of dignity in for people who have lost a job, for example, but there is also loss of dignity in the job itself. And part of the problems that I was discussing for the person who lose their job making furniture and get a job selling furniture is that they lose their position at the top of an experience ladder, not necessarily a hierarchy, but an experience ladder, and the idea that they are qualified as what they are doing to become, one cog in a huge machine. And this idea of one cog in a huge machine, I think, is a part of sort of the distress at work that is experienced in many countries, very, very prevalent in France, for example. And when people are able to get jobs in the social economy, there are organizations, for example, OECD First World, that are trying to do to model the way that people can have dignity through the employment relation at work, as well as through the sense what meaning their work has in their that is NGO led. They can also lead to useful models that can be used to larger corporations. So for example, OECD First World is doing, they have a small enterprise that does mostly work, service work for other NGOs, employing people with complicated history, giving them dignity and strength in the process. But that small enterprise, it's like a lab from which they extract lessons that they then can share with people, with kind of much larger funds for how employees need to be given a sense of the mission and need to be treated in the mission. On the local jobs, that's a great question as well. I think we can sort of, in the book, we discuss it both ways, which is that how to encourage the mobility and make it possible, and what do you do for people who will not move, or for whom moving would be too costly. And one want to work on the two axes. So for encouraging the mobility, it's not just about regulation, it's also about housing. I talked about the housing for poor people in work sites, but housing for young French people in cities is just the same thing. It's about housing, it's about childcare. But part of it is just not easy to reproduce because it's your social network, your extended family, your place in society. And for some people, staying home is what makes the most sense. And there we actually make the proposal, which is somewhat controversial, is that one should be willing to subsidize firms to stay in where they are, and in particular to keep the older people employed, even if it's not economically viable. And one should think of that as an externality to preserve the social environment, in the same way that we are willing to ask people to force people to do things to preserve the physical environment, and implicitly that costs money to us. One should also be willing to preserve the social environment by keeping people employed and not letting, villages and small towns just collapse onto themselves.
Okay, Juan.
Yes, Professor Duflo, thank you. Thank you very much. Very inspiring, fascinating presentation, and extremely useful for all our work here at the OECD. I have a very quick question for you. You made some rather sobering comments about the economics profession, and you happen to be the second woman after Elinor Ostrom to have earned the Nobel Prize in economics. So you spoke a lot about conventional wisdom amongst the white men community in the economics profession. So how much do you think we've moved on, and how much universities, colleges, not just in the US, but across the world, need to do still to become more inclusive, more diverse, to make sure that they bring in all this new thinking, new ideas, and certainly that they really reflect the problems faced by minorities and other people discriminated in our societies. I'd be interested to hear about your own experience in universities, not just in the US, but elsewhere. Thank you.
We've not moved on far enough by far. So I think so for women, clearly there are not enough women in economics profession at every level. There are not enough students, undergraduate students, graduate students, junior faculty, senior faculty, and people who get prizes. It's at all levels. But at least there are some. The minorities is just even worse. I mean, there are so few faces that are either African or African American in the profession. It is just disgraceful. And not only that, but I think it has, not only we've not moved on, but in some ways it's become worse. So for example, at MIT in the 70s, we used to have African Americans in the PhD program every year, a couple of them. There used to be a program to find them, and some of them are, many of them have become super successful. And that has completely disappeared. And we have today in our entire PhD program, we have one African American student across all the years. And I don't think that's unique, and that's terrible, both because that reflects a lack of opportunities and because that, you know, economics is a social science. So if you don't have a diversity of perspectives, then you're going to have a very poor field, in the sense that a lot of the questions that need to be addressed won't be addressed. So I think it is very costly for the field. Until very recently, it is not neither the position of women or the position of minority is something that the field was willing to reckon with. And I think it has changed in the last few years for women first, and I'm sure the current Black Lives Matter movement will make it change for minority. There are things we can do, there are things we must do. As economists, we have always tended to think that the market will take care of things and we better do nothing and continue to select what we think are the best people, and, you know, goodness will ensue. And I think we now realize that that's not the way it works, that there are changes that are needed to our culture, to our cultures of seminar, to when people can speak and how they are addressed. And there are things we need to do in our selection criteria, and so on and so forth. And I'm very convinced we can do much better. It will not take 2 minutes, but we have to start the journey. I think until quite recently, there was not even a willingness to start on it, and now it has changed.
Okay, finally, Stefan Jacobson.
Thank you, Mario, and thank you, Dr. Duflo, for being with us. I also had the pleasure to listen to your intervention on the economists as plumbers some years ago with us as well. We just had a webinar today on evaluation at the time of crisis, and our friends from Colombia were telling us how they are working to support the informality in the economy, and they are apparently working with the Impact for Poverty Action organization, which I think is close to you. And I heard that during the discussions, a lot was said about creating jobs, preserving good quality jobs. But unfortunately, a lot of the jobs are gone, at least in the short term with the crisis. So my question to you is, how should countries think about supporting informality? Because that's in the sense what Colombia does, trying to see, and how does the crisis bring us to rethink the border between formality and informality. We also saw that in some of the European countries, the resurgence of the diseases across some of the marginalized groups, as was the case, I think, in Germany or in Italy recently. So what can countries do to sort of think about this formal to informality transition and address that in the post-COVID context? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question and a difficult question. I think in the short run, this gets addressed by being a bit systematic and making sure that the welfare, the protection system we have, in particular cash payment, the way of getting money to people, doesn't depend on people formality or informality status. So in the poorer country, you know, this is going to be addressed by this universal ultra basic income, where basically everybody qualifies, formal or informal. In the richer country, we have much less of that issues. We know where people are. We can give them unemployment insurance, minimum survival things, or support them through their job. In countries like in Latin America is where they are kind of falling in the middle and that's always been an issue with middle income countries, where if you have very generous informal systems, then nobody wants to get formal, and that creates fiscal issues. But I think in a context like COVID, we need to tilt it back towards supporting people unconditionally of their status. To make sure that, because again, the problem that we face in a context like COVID is a problem of inclusion. You really don't want to miss out people who need to be helped. And the more you have requirement in terms of being formal to join the system, the more likely you are to kick out large swaths of the population that you really need to include.
SG, if you want to conclude, SG.
Well, listen, there's a love song in Spanish, which is called The Clock. And it's about, telling the clock to stop, stop ticking, stop your way so that this can go on and on and on, Here, I am reminded of that because we just would like to continue to pick your brain and to ask you questions. And we are all seeking answers, better policies for lives is our motto. But to do that, we really need all the inspiration. And you have given us plenty. It has been a privilege. It has been a pleasure. It has also been fun, Esther. And also to welcome you back a su casa, as we say in Mexico. It's also been very enlightening and very challenging. And I have to say, as an economist, and for all the economists that were listening to you, mostly they are economists, I have to say it was also very sobering. So thank you very, very much. And of course, as they properly say in French, à bientôt. Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Thank you very much for your attention and good luck with your work.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.